Today, I have the great pleasure of speaking with Dr. Ruth Freeman. And Ruth is Director, Science for Society at Science Foundation Ireland. And we will chat about the voice of the public in research. Hi, Ruth. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, it's an absolute honour and a pleasure to have you here, Ruth. And the first question for you today, as always, Ruth, is where are you located and what has been keeping you going over the last few months?
Well, I am very lucky to be located in the lovely seaside town of Dalkey, where I grew up. And I'm afraid I fall into the stereotype of what's been keeping me going, which is that sunrise swim and then back into the dry robe before I jump back in front of the computer. But with three very little people at home through the whole of lockdown, that early morning half hour has been pretty important to keep me sane.
I am absolutely sure. So Ruth, you are the Director of Science for Society at Science Foundation Ireland. Can you please tell our audience about your research or your role, please, and what makes you so passionate about what you do?
Yeah, well, I don't tell everyone this, Patricia, but I will tell you. I am lucky enough to have one of the best jobs ever, because what I look after in Science for Society is everything from our education and public engagement. So everything from inspiring teachers, parents and kids to think about STEM and STEAM, all the way through to public engagement and things like Science Week, and then running all of our programs that support individual researchers with amazing ideas and getting to hear how they're getting on. And then our newest division, which is our challenge funding research, which is about, I suppose, supporting researchers to bring their incredible intellects to really tangled problems that they need to disentangle. So it's an amazing role that I just feel so privileged to have. I mean, I love working across disciplines and with different researchers and from everyone to kind of 5 to 105. I really love it.
It sounds wonderful. You've really sold it to us, Ruth. So actually moving on to your title, The Voice of the Public in Research, maybe you can tell us, our audience, a little bit about this, please.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said, we set up this challenge funding division in SFI a number of years ago. So we had to go out and look at kind of what was best practice in challenge research. And we ended up coming up with this idea that we'd set up teams of researchers that were trying to solve a really particular problem, but we would get them to bring onto the team a societal champion. That's what we called it. But it was kind of a person who really understood the problem, or maybe was living the problem, and that they would be an integral part of the team the whole way along. And so we started out with that idea, and the more and more we thought about it, the more this idea kind of cemented with me. How do we bring the voice of the non-researcher into research? And I remember I was out visiting one of our large research centers where they study a particular disease, and we had an international reviewer talking to a researcher about a new therapy that they were developing that was potentially a challenging therapy to implement. And I remember this researcher being asked, what do you think patients would think about this? And it kind of transpired that they had never met a person with the disease that they were studying. And I kind of reflected, for me now, this seems unusual, but I think for a lot of researchers, particularly those of us who are scientists, we kind of feel we need to stay in that science box, and maybe we're not qualified to go outside of it. But I guess I think we need to.
Wow, it sounds, really what is coming across, and it's something we're passionate about in UCD Discovery, is interdisciplinarity. So maybe you could give us one, I suppose, standout example of a true interdisciplinary project of interest to our audience.
Oh, I mean, God, there's so many that we've been lucky enough to be working on. I mean, I think there's a project that we funded actually under our first Future Innovator Prize, which was looking at an injectable pain medication. And it was just an incredible team that brought together engineers, geriatricians, pain medication specialists, but also patients, older people who had lived with chronic pain for years, who were feeding back their expertise. Every good so many good products have good software, because now we live so much of what we do through digital. So there's often a digital component. But we were really proud of this first team that brought this amazing pain medication all the way through our challenge funding, and now are just soaring from there on. They're doing so well. They're looking at investment and really trying to bring that medication through, but with the voice of the patient the whole way.
Wow, that's just inspiring work that you're doing in SFI. So just maybe before, so Audience, please do remember to submit your questions, but just before, maybe I can sneak one of my own in based on our chat earlier today. So we had a great chat this morning about, you know, the founding of the internet and the coinciding founding of GM engineering. So maybe, you know, you can talk to our audience a little bit about that. That was fascinating for me.
Yeah, well, I suppose as I've been on this kind of journey myself about thinking about where the public's voice should come into research, I was kind of looking back at a number of different sort of the dawn of a number of technologies that have been quite recent. And my background training is in genetics, and you know, when I was studying genetics in Trinity, it was really in the peak of the fear around Frankenstein food and GM, and we could see this technology had come out, and people really sort of resisted it. They said, no, we do not like that technology. I think people almost had a visceral reaction to this interfering with living things. And I noticed I was interested because it was actually 1994 when the first commercial GM crop was launched. And that was also the year that commercial traffic was allowed on the internet for the first time. So, you know, it started out with those sort of cheesy social networking apps and things like Alta Vista, those old search engines, but quickly it became e-commerce. And the public had such a different reaction to that technology. You know, there was very much like, yeah, this is great. This is fun. This is enabling. Let's bring it in. And I suppose I do reflect where we are today. You know, that digital technology has almost come into our lives without us really having a debate about the negatives. And a lot of genetic technology has actually moved incredibly slowly. And I think when I look back over the last 20 years, I think a stronger voice of the public, but also different types of perspectives, philosophers, artists, creatives, those kind of people, if we'd had a more structured discussion about the pros and cons of both technologies, I think maybe we'd be in a better place with both of them.
Okay. And it was very interesting. You mentioned artists, but you mentioned like David Bowie earlier. So maybe you can tell our audience about that.
Yeah, well, again, in sort of looking into this subject, it's really fascinating. If you ever get a bit of time to go back and look at some of the early interviews about the early internet days, and you will see a lot of the people that were involved in those early companies, and even in just software companies like Microsoft, and they were sort of saying, we can't really see any issues with the internet. I mean, they were asked, well, what if people put up stuff that's not true? And they sort of said, well, why would anyone do that? And by contrast, then there's an amazing interview with David Bowie, which has kind of gone down in history, where he talks about the internet almost like this monster that has positives, but negatives as well. He saw that dark side straight away. So I think for all of us as researchers, it's good to keep our eyes and ears open to different perspectives and ask people, maybe create that structure to get that information into our work.
That's why interdisciplinarity and challenge-based funding is so important. Yeah. So I better stop asking my own questions. There are so many coming in, Ruth. So here's one for you. Has COVID-19 taught us that science communication is more than just a field in social science, but it's a public health imperative?
Yeah, I mean, it's been amazing as someone who works in science communication to watch the way the public have engaged with COVID-19 and all of the information. And I think what it says to me is that it's all of our jobs. I mean, whether you're a science communicator or a scientist, it's a collective responsibility. And I have to say, I've broadly been incredibly impressed with the level of science communication that's gone on during COVID. I mean, I know there's been debates about people talking outside of their direct expertise and those kind of things, but I think in general, it's been a good nuanced debate. And I think what's been important is the public have been on the journey with scientists. So we've been down maybe the places where we thought something and then we got new evidence and we changed our perspective. So that whole process of science, which is about when you get new evidence, you know, you change, not your view, but you move closer towards hopefully that truth. And I think it's actually been a really enlightening debate over the whole COVID times for the public to understand around certainties when scientists talk, around evidence. I mean, you hear people phoning into the radio talking about preprints and things like that, like our private language is now on the airwaves. And that's been great, you know?
Yeah, it's fantastic and actually quite related to it, but also a controversial question. So I'm just teeing that up for you first is, are COVID-19 conspiracy theories a failure of science communication?
I mean, I think there are conspiracy theories, and I suppose if you talk, I mean, actually, someone who talks really eloquently about this is Mark Little, you know, the
Yeah.
from Stureful, and I mean, I really have a lot of time for Mark and the way he has analysed this. It's amazing. I mean, I think where there's maybe something that we need to think about is a lot of those conspiracy theories come from organized disinformation. And I think it's very hard to challenge organized disinformation without organized information. And I think as scientists and researchers, that is something that we are going to have to start looking at. How do we parse out, in a way, the information that we all pretty much agree on? And then how do we communicate that? Because I think often it is the gray areas that are exploited by organized disinformation. And we have to be able to have gray areas, because sometimes there are gray areas, and we have to be able to have those debates. But we also have to communicate clearly, probably the 90 to 95% that we're all pretty much agreed on. And I think that is maybe where we fall down sometimes, because we get sucked into the gray areas, because that's often the interests, the new areas. But we have to remember to talk about all the things that are very clear to us as scientists. So for me, I think that's something I've been thinking about, how we might do that better.
Great. And just, I suppose, the last question on the pandemic is, will science be a winner or a loser as a result of the pandemic?
I think it'll be a winner. I mean, I suppose I'm optimistic, but you know, I think science, I feel very proud to be involved in science over the course of the last year. I mean, I think every good news story on the vaccine is just really a wonderful story, and a story of that sort of what can be achieved when science is given support and everyone gets behind it. And I suppose I hope that we can put the collective muscle of science behind some other really big, important global issues, and maybe do that in a coordinated way. I mean, my team ran the COVID-19 rapid response call in Ireland for research in COVID, and we tried to coordinate as much as we could internationally in the midst of immense time pressure. But I think if we could coordinate even better and maybe pick a few big issues that we want to work on together, it'd be great to unleash the muscle of science on some other big topics.
I think so. I think the future is really bright. But so just to change, I suppose, topic now for you completely almost, is this is an interesting one. Any advice for early career researchers to transition from academia into the more non-traditional, non-academic jobs such as your own? It's an area that really interests me in my final year of my PhD.
Yeah, well, I mean, SFI, we run a number of fellowship programs. So we run fellowships. We run the Public Service Fellowship, where you can go and spend some time in the public sector. We run our own fellowship, where you can come and try working with SFI for a couple of years. And we also run an industry fellowship, where we partner with companies. So I think certainly try and get in some experience in a few different areas is a really good way to start. But I think the other side of it is look at your skill set. I mean, for most of us now, you know, we're not necessarily at the bench all the time, but we're using those skills that we learned during our PhD and during our undergrad training. So I think it's really important to look at those skills and then look really broadly, you know, really have a very open mind, because those skills that you learn in research actually equip you for a huge range of roles. But there's good opportunities there to try things out.
Great. And again, complete change back to, I suppose, more the public engagement in science. So there's a good few questions coming in around the idea of a citizens' assembly and the idea of a wider framework on how we bring the public on a journey with researchers as we move into the future. So maybe you could, I suppose there's a lot of questions around that, Ruth, but maybe you could just answer that in general.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, we're delighted actually. Simon Harris, the Minister for Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science, has announced this year that his department, you know, with us supporting, is going to run this national conversation on research, because I think it's all very well to say the public should get involved, but I think we need to make structures for them to get involved. And again, Ireland has, you know, really led in this idea of a citizens' assembly, where if you bring in a cross section of the public and you give them access to information and space to discuss, you can have very, very productive discussions. So we're hoping that, you know, throughout the year, there will be a lot of things going on where the public can come in and have slightly sort of organized and supported discussion around issues that we are going to have to face. I mean, again, I sort of hark back, but things like genomics. I mean, all of the children who have been born in the last few years will have access to their full DNA code. And at the moment, we have no framework for how they are going to, what they are going to do with that information. I think it would be remiss of us if we didn't provide them with the structures and the sort of philosophical framework for them to deal with that information about themselves. So there are responsibilities on us that we have to fulfill.
And then I suppose just to, because we're completely out of time, the idea, I suppose it all goes back to what I'm seeing, what's coming in, it's all going back to science communication and an interdisciplinary approach. I'm trying to summarize about 4 questions here in one go, so bear with me. So, so science communication, interdisciplinarity, they're basically asking how can everyone, politicians, journalists, artists, writers, everyone get involved to, I suppose, move science forward?
I think we need to create some of those opportunities. I think us as researchers, we'll have to create some of the structures and invite people in. I mean, to some extent, this is our tent. So we have to open the door and we have to say to people, come in, you are welcome for a start. We will make an effort to explain things to you. And we don't have all the answers. So I think some of it is about setting up a structure that we open the door and we let people in. We invite them in with open arms and we welcome their input. And that's a very good start, hopefully, to a productive dialogue.
And you know what, Ruth, that's a wonderful close. I love it. Welcome them, everyone in with open arms. That's exactly it. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are completely out of time today. So sincere apologies to all of you whose questions I did not get to, but I just want to say, take this opportunity to say an absolutely huge thanks to Ruth. Fascinating discussion today. Thank you so much, Ruth.
Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.
And you get lots of claps. And thank you everyone for joining in as always. And don't forget, you can sign up for our series at zoomforthought.ie, where you can check out our list of upcoming speakers. And I will see you all next week on Zoom for Thought. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.